I gotta tell you before you hire me. I don't work cheap.
At 94, Clint Eastwood finally breaks his silence, revealing the truth about Gene Hackman, the man who was his greatest rival, his closest equal, and the one ghost he could never quite outrun. For over half a century, their story has been one of unspoken grudges and quiet respect, of near fights and unforgettable performances. The world saw them as legends, gunslingers on and off the screen, but beneath the surface lay something far more complicated. A friendship that was never easy, a rivalry that never faded, and a secret Clint once thought he'd take to his grave. Now, time is running out. And before the final curtain falls, Clint is ready to say what was left unsaid about Gene, about their battles, and about the truth that bound them together in ways neither could admit. Until now, Clint Eastwood sat in contemplative silence by the living room window, his aged hand resting lightly on the worn wooden armrest. The twilight cast long shadows through the glass, painting the dusty photographs on the walls with a pale orange hue. At 94, each passing day felt like a thin sheet of paper ready to be torn by the winds of memory. But today, the wind carried no scent of gunpowder from the Wild West, nor the rustle of a new script. Today there was only silence, and that silence bore the name Gene Hackman. Clint Eastwood had long lived with silence as a stern old friend. Those who knew him understood Clint was not one to dwell on the past, much less cling to old glories. But this silence was different from any he had known. It was as heavy as the click of an empty gun, as the last hoofbeat on parched earth. Because the man now at rest was none other than Little Bill Daggett. Clint and Gene were not the kind of friends who called each other daily or met on weekends. They were friends of an older generation, men who communicated through glances, nods, and terse exchanges between takes. Unforgiven was not just an Oscar-winning film. It was a chain that bound two Western souls together. Throughout Hollywood's history, there have been countless pairs of colleagues turned rivals, but Clint and Gene never let accolades or spotlights dim their respect for each other. When Unforgiven premiered in 1992, Clint was 62. Gene, at that time, was exactly 62. Two old souls stepped out of the shadows of a golden era to tell their own story. Aging heroes, surviving too many encounters, too many stray bullets. It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. William Money's line echoed like a tolling bell, haunting those who had worn the cowboy hat in real life. And from then on, Clint and Gene implicitly understood that their bond was sealed. Unbreakable. But time spares no monuments. In the following years, Clint continued his relentless work on film sets, while Gene vanished without a formal farewell. No retirement party, no emotional speech. Gene Hackman, the relentless cop Popeye Doyle, who once shook America, suddenly disappeared from Hollywood's radar as if he had never existed. Clint called a few times, then stopped. He understood. Old gunslingers sometimes choose to fade into the shadows quietly, as a final bullet hitting the floorboards. Every time Gene's name was mentioned, Clint's eyes darkened. He was one of the best, he said tersely, then fell silent. No one knew what they had said to each other after their last meeting. All anyone saw was that whenever Unforgiven was mentioned, Clint retreated to his private room, sat pensively by his old guitar, and quietly strummed a few notes. Once, when asked if he kept in touch with Gene, Clint just smiled faintly. We had our time. But what was the truth? No one knew. Clint was not one to share easily, and Gene even less so. Both carried the weight of being cowboys lost in a digital age, symbols of an era when men settled things with guns and silence. But Gene's passing, with all its strangeness and mystery, forced Clint to break that unwavering rule. When the news about Gene spread, Clint was in the middle of a documentary project about the American West. He stopped filming, canceled his schedule, and disappeared for nearly a week. Close associates said that for the first time in years, Clint secluded himself in his log cabin in Carmel, where he had once shared whiskey with Gene on a winter afternoon in 1993. No one knew what he was thinking, only that when he emerged, his face bore deeper wrinkles. And then, just when everyone thought Clint would remain silent as always, he spoke. No fanfare, no grandstanding. In 2015, a handwritten letter with no return address, bearing only 3 shaky letters in the left corner, GH, appeared in the old wooden mailbox at Clint Eastwood's Carmel home. The letter was discovered by Dina, his ex-wife, who still occasionally visited to care for the house when Clint was away. She placed it on his desk beside a pile of dusty scripts and quietly left without a word. She knew that letter was more important than any $1 million script because it came from Gene Hackman, the old friend who never ceased to haunt Clint, even when they no longer stood together under the studio lights. Inside, the envelope was a yellowed piece of paper with slanted, trembling handwriting that still retained the sharp sharpness of a man who had held countless golden statuettes. No greetings, no lengthy introductions. Gene went straight to the point, as he had always faced everything in life. One last ride, Clint. Just you and me. No Oscars, no press, no agents, just us, and a story that only we can tell. Clint read and reread that letter so many times that the edges became wrinkled and yellowed with age. But he never replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because Clint knew some journeys were meant only to be dreamed, never to be taken. The relationship between Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman did not begin on the set of Unforgiven. In fact, they first met in the 70s, when Clint was struggling to escape the shadow of Dirty Harry, and Gene had just won an Oscar for The French Connection. The brief encounter at a producer's party left no particular impression. Clint stood quietly in a corner, a glass of whiskey gently swirling in his hand, while Gene laughed loudly, his eyes flashing with the swagger of a recent victor. They were 2 contrasting pieces, one as silent as a cold gun, the other as volatile as a lit fuse. Then, in 1992, Unforgiven drew them together. No fanfare, no trumpets. Just 2 old cowboys sharing a final cigarette before sunset. Clint never forgot Gene's gaze after the final scene, when William Money turned and walked away into the rain. Gene watched him. No acting, no dialogue. Just the genuine look of a man who knew his time was ending. From that look, an invisible thread connected the 2 men. After Unforgiven, they didn't see each other often. Dinners became infrequent, phone calls spaced years apart. But the handwritten letters never stopped. Gene didn't use email, and Clint didn't like texting. Both believed that only handwritten words carried the full weight of what they couldn't say aloud. In those letters, there were jokes about the increasingly cheap Hollywood, reminiscences about filming in the freezing cold, and confessions that could only be made alone at a writing desk. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we did one more? Gene wrote once. Clint read it, folded it, put it in a drawer, and stepped out onto the porch to light a cigar. He didn't reply, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the question itself was enough. They both knew the shadow of Unforgiven was too large, so large that anything they did afterward would be a faint shadow beside it. But in 2015, Gene wrote again. No hints, no hesitations. This time, he made a direct invitation. There's a story we haven't told, Clint. The story of two men who should have died long ago but somehow kept writing. Let's tell it before it's too late. Clint held that letter for a long time. In his mind, the frames automatically rewound. Two old cowboys, backs hunched, hands trembling, facing each other on a dusty street. No more guns, only unspoken words. But Clint knew Gene wasn't just inviting him to make a movie. He was inviting Clint on one last ride. The ride of two old souls who had survived every storm. A film could fail, but a friendship would not. Yet Clint declined, not by letter, not by phone. He simply remained silent, like William Money's silence before each bullet. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was afraid. Afraid that when they stood together again, all the legends would crumble. Two old cowboys, now just two old men trembling under the yellow lights, and Gene deserved more than that. Gene understood. He didn't write another letter. But in 2019, knowing he didn't have much time left, Gene sent Clint a small gift, an old leather-bound notebook with only one line inside. "We had our ride, partner. That's all that matters." Clint kept that notebook with him through the following years. Every time he opened it, he remembered Gene's back fading through the old wooden door. No need for a final film. No need for another collaboration. They had their own ride, quiet, silent, but enduring as the hoofbeats in the still night. When the news of Gene's passing spread, Clint didn't cry. He simply opened the old notebook, sat on the porch, and whispered, "See you at the next town, partner, because old cowboys never say goodbye. They just ride away, leaving behind untold legends." In 2018, at a corner table in a small seaside bar in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat across from his longtime agent, a thick stack of scripts in front of him. These weren't the ordinary Hollywood scripts that filled his mailbox every week. This was a special project, a project proposed by a special person, Gene Hackman. It began a few months earlier when Gene, who had almost entirely withdrawn from public life after his final film, Welcome to Mooseport, in 2004, unexpectedly called Clint. Gene's voice was much deeper than in previous years. The booming laughter and familiar sarcastic jokes were gone. Instead, there was a slowness, as if each word was carefully weighed before being spoken. "Clint, I've got something. Maybe my last. I don't know how much time I have left, but if there's one last film, I only want to do it with you." Clint remained silent for a long time, on the other end of the line. They say when old gunslingers talk about their last stand, it means the gun is loaded. It's just that no one knows where that bullet will land. That film was never announced. No title. No producers. Not even a formal contract. Just the initial idea, handwritten on a crumpled piece of paper. Two old cowboys, once brothers in arms, now facing each other at opposite ends of a town, each carrying a secret that cannot be revealed. A gunfight no one wants, but cannot avoid. Clint liked the idea. Gene liked it too, but that was their last point of agreement. The project dragged on through endless arguments. Clint wanted the film to be nostalgic, a quiet farewell to their golden era. Gene wanted it gritty, cold, exposing the dark side of legends. No more glory, just festering scars beneath wrinkled skin. They argued through handwritten letters, then over the phone. The letters that once bound them together became sharp weapons. Gene accused Clint of being too afraid to tarnish his own monument. Clint mocked Gene for trying to cling to fading light, word by word, sentence by sentence. They pushed each other away. The climax was a closed-door meeting between the two in Santa Fe in late 2018. No assistants, no producers. Just two men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder, now facing each other in a dimly lit room. No one knows exactly what was said in that room, but according to a hotel employee who overheard, Gene left first, slamming the door so hard that the picture on the wall shook. Clint stayed behind, staring blankly at the glass of whiskey in front of him, not taking a sip. That film died that day. No official announcement, no explanation. Just a long silence, like their later careers. Those who had worked with both Clint and Gene understood that something had broken. A bullet had been fired between the two legends, but it missed its target, leaving a void hanging in the air, impossible to fill. In 2021, at the height of the pandemic, when everything stood still, Gene unexpectedly called Clint. It was their first call after more than 2 years of silence. No one knew who dialed first, but they both knew it might be the last time they remained silent for a long time after the initial greeting. Gene asked about his health. Clint answered briefly. They talked about the weather, gas prices, old movies they had both starred in, but no one mentioned the unfinished film from 2018. Suddenly, Gene stopped, his voice very soft, as if he were talking to himself. "Clint, do you remember the last scene of Unforgiven, when I stood there watching you ride away in the rain?" Clint was silent. Gene chuckled softly. "I never said, but I knew then. I knew we would never have another time." Clint wanted to say something, but his throat tightened. The call ended with a sigh on both ends. They didn't hang up immediately, they just left it there, listening to each other's breaths, as if two old cowboys stood at opposite ends of a town, hands touching their gun holsters, but neither drawing. After that call, Clint told a close friend, "I don't think I'll talk to Gene again." And he was right. When the news of Gene's passing spread in 2023, Clint didn't make a statement, didn't post a tribute. He just retreated to his ranch, opened an old drawer where he kept all the letters Gene had sent. Letters from their youth to the final trembling words. Clint reread them all, every word, every punctuation mark, as if trying to find any secrets Gene had left unsaid. He found no secrets. He only saw the gaps, unfinished sentences, crossed-out words, unsent letters. Gene Hackman's greatest secret wasn't in those lines. It was in the long silence between them, a missed bullet hanging between two old friends, never to fall. And Clint understood that a part of his own soul had gone with Gene at the end of that dusty road years ago. The news of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa being found deceased in their small Santa Fe home did not come as a shock to Clint Eastwood. At 94, Clint understood that quiet departures in the night were no longer unfamiliar. What made him stand motionless by the window of his Carmel ranch that morning was not the news of Gene's passing, but the confirmation that the final words that should have been spoken would forever remain unspoken. The press immediately swarmed, scouring every corner for a statement from Clint. For 2 years, Clint and Gene had been like ghosts, never meeting, never mentioning each other's names, not even a text message since their last phone call in 2021. When they were silent with each other more than they spoke, every bridge had collapsed. But that very afternoon, Clint broke his silence, not through his manager, not with a cold statement. He stood before the lens of a local newspaper himself, his voice hoarse from age and years of self-imposed silence. There was no finer actor than Gene Hackman, and no friend more important to me than him. Just 2 sentences. No excess. No embellishment. But those who had followed the two old cowboys for decades understood Clint Eastwood had never said such things about anyone. Not about Sergio Leone. Not about Lee Van Cleef. Not even about his first wife. Only for Gene Hackman. The journalists thought that was it, but no. After that brief statement, Clint drove back to his ranch, closed the doors, and cut off all communication. Landline, cell phone, old fax machine, all went silent as a desert after a gunfight. Only one call was made. The recipient was Kyle Eastwood, Clint's eldest son, who understood better than anyone the strange yet profound relationship between his father and Gene Hackman. According to Kyle's account to a close friend, Clint's voice that day was different, softer yet heavier. The man with no-name toughness was gone, replaced by the voice of an old man finally admitting he had lost the battle with himself. "We wasted too much time being stubborn old bastards." Just one sentence. No excuses. No justifications. But that sentence contained all the regret, self-deprecation, and affection. Gene Hackman was not just a co-star, not just a comrade in cinematic battles. He was the only mirror that reflected a raw, flawed, and vulnerable Clint Eastwood behind the cold cowboy facade. And Clint knew he was also the only mirror in which Gene Hackman dared to see himself. Two stubborn old men, as Clint called them, had spent nearly 50 years doing everything except admitting how much they needed each other. They shared letters, stories, unfulfilled dreams. They engaged in arguments, slammed phones, had long, reasonless drinking sessions. But they never said that when the final day came, the most painful thing was not losing a friend, but realizing they had pushed that friend too far away, beyond the point of return. And then, when the dust settled, Clint sat there alone on his porch, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. No cigarettes, no whiskey. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the old wooden planks. Those close to him knew Clint Eastwood was not one to cry easily. But that day, Kyle said, his eyes were red. Some tears never fall but seep inward, silently eroding the hardest edges of an old cowboy's soul. Clint had survived hundreds of gunfights on screen, but the final battle with his own stubbornness was his most bitter defeat. The press continued to speculate, to dig. Was there a joint will between Clint and Gene? A secret agreement about the unfinished film from 2018? Was there a final letter Clint never sent? No one knew except Clint, and he would never tell. All the world saw was a gaunt old man sitting quietly at his dining table, fiddling with an old lighter, a birthday gift Gene gave him in 1985, after Pale Rider was released. Engraved on it were just two words, compadre. Not friend, not brother. Just compadre, a companion, a gunslinger ready to stand shoulder to shoulder, but also ready to draw his gun if necessary. As twilight fell on the Carmel Ranch, Clint's shadow stretched across the wooden floor, blending with the sound of the waves. Life went on as it always did. But somewhere in the fading light, perhaps Gene Hackman still stood, squinting at his old friend, as they had on those days when they stood at opposite ends of a town. No greetings, no gunshots. Just old souls finally learning to let go. The news of Gene Hackman and his wife passing away together on a quiet afternoon in Santa Fe swept through Hollywood like a cold wind. No fanfare, no grandstanding. Exactly in keeping with his quiet lifestyle during his last 20 years. But when that wind subsided, it left a vast emptiness, not just in cinema history, but in the hearts of those who had stood with Gene under the lights. Hollywood awoke bewildered to realize a monument had quietly ridden into the sunset. Tributes appeared like a night rain, quiet but persistent. From young faces who had never met Gene in person to veterans who saw him as the standard of acting, all dedicated heartfelt words to that gruff but supremely talented cowboy. Morgan Freeman, who stood shoulder to shoulder with Gene in Unforgiven, shared a black and white photo from 1992 when three men, Clint, Gene, and Morgan, sat together on a wooden porch, each with a cigarette, looking into the distance Gene was the only one who could make Clint Eastwood lose his patience on set. But Clint was also the only one who could make Gene Hackman burst into laughter with a dry joke. They were like oil and water and couldn't live without each other. But the most anticipated voice, of course, was Clint Eastwood's. Clint didn't write much. He sent only one handwritten letter through his manager to The Hollywood Reporter. The letter was short, but each sentence seemed to encapsulate half a century of ups and downs between two cowboys. Gene Hackman and I were never close friends, at least not by Hollywood's definition. We didn't text each other. We didn't invite each other to birthday parties. We argued more than we laughed. We were silent more than we spoke. But if anyone asked me at the other end of my gun who I most wanted to see, the answer was always Gene Hackman. Just 4 sentences, but all of Hollywood was stunned. That declaration to the American film industry was almost a legendary vow, because if Clint Eastwood was the last survivor of the Golden Cowboy era, then Gene Hackman was the only one who dared to stand on equal footing with him. Fearless, unyielding. Not an enemy, not quite an ally, but the only one Clint believed worthy of his final shot. The story of Unforgiven was mentioned the most. The bleak, brutal cowboy film where Clint and Gene first aimed guns at each other on screen and off. The media revisited behind-the-scenes stories, like when Gene Hackman went berserk, when Clint changed the dialogue on set, or when Clint silently walked out of a meeting because Gene made a remark that touched his directorial ego. But at the end of the day, they always came back. Richard Harris, a late colleague, once said, "Like 2 lost cowboys. No matter how much they cursed each other, they knew they only had each other." Old photos flooded social media. Clint and Gene standing in the cold rain in Alberta, dusty coats on, eyes squinting from the wind. 2 men not smiling, not posing, just standing there, as if nothing in the world mattered except the person next to them. Hollywood loves glittering stories, but the story of Clint and Gene was full of rough edges. No perfect friendship, no evenings of heart-to-heart beers, just awkward handshakes after each argument. Short, handwritten letters containing 1,000 unsaid words. And perhaps that imperfect friendship was what made Hollywood respect them more than any polished bromance. We don't have to like each other to know we need each other. Clint's quote from 2004 suddenly went viral again, shared across film forums. Gene Hackman passed away, taking his untold secrets with him, but Clint Eastwood was still here, a lone gunslinger standing on a hilltop, looking down at the valley of the past. Now there was no one at the other end of the gun to annoy Clint, to argue about each scene, to sit silently next to him after each long day of filming. No one understood Clint Eastwood like Gene Hackman did. Hollywood remembered Gene Hackman as a cinematic monument, but to Clint, Gene wasn't a legend. He was just the only old man who dared to call Clint stubborn, then burst into laughter. The only one who dared to throw a script in Clint's face, then pick it up himself, revise it, and say, "Do it properly." And as night fell, amidst the dim yellow lights of a roadside bar, perhaps somewhere in the Hollywood sky, 2 cowboy ghosts were riding side by side on a dusty trail, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Just 2 old men finally riding together, as it should have been. January 2024. As winter blanketed Carmel by the sea in white, Clint Eastwood sat at an old wooden table by the window, calloused fingers gripping a fountain pen that had been his companion for decades. Before him, a blank sheet of paper lay silent, as if awaiting a final confession. Clint was not one for apologies, much less explanations. He wrote slowly, each stroke trembling as if each letter carried the weight of a heavy past. The letter was to Gene Hackman, his friend, his adversary, the only person Clint Eastwood both wanted to avoid and see again most in the world. "Gene, I guess we both thought we had more time. Turns out all we had was Unforgiven. The words were brief, stark, like Clint himself, but behind those black ink lines lay a lifetime of ups and downs between two old cowboys, arguments over every frame, long silent phone calls, glances that understood each other's every breath, though neither would admit it. Clint folded the letter, slipped it into a faded brown envelope, but then he didn't send it. The letter remained in an old wooden box in the corner of the room where Clint kept scripts that were never filmed, smudged behind-the-scenes photos, and untold memories of Gene Hackman. The box was like a wordless diary where everything Clint never said was buried. When his family found it after Gene Hackman and his wife passed away, the letter was still there, intact, unstamped, never leaving that room. A letter never sent, but also no longer needed because the recipient had understood long ago. Some friendships don't need a perfect ending. Some apologies don't need to be spoken. And some cowboys are born to stand at opposite ends of a town, neither advancing nor turning away, just silently waiting for each other in the twilight. That evening, Clint sat on his porch, eyes fixed on the fiery horizon. The evening shadows stretched long, enveloping his gaunt figure. An old gunslinger finally understanding that all the grudges, stubbornness, and pride between him and Gene Hackman never really mattered. Because all that remained were the passing winds carrying the distant sound of hoofbeats, where two old gunslingers finally rode side by side on a road no longer divided. The letter still lay in the old box, a final secret between two men. And Clint Eastwood, the last cowboy, whispered into the darkness, "I'll see you, Gene, when the dust settles." Two last cowboys, one fallen, one standing alone in the final wind of the Old West. No winners, no losers, just unspoken words, unsent letters, and rusty guns lying still under the dust of time. But what exactly did that letter contain beyond its opening line? What final truth did Clint Eastwood want to share with Gene Hackman that he couldn't bring himself to mail? Perhaps the world will never know. Or perhaps one day, when the last gunslinger follows his old friend into the sunset, that final confession will be revealed. The last chapter in Hollywood's most enigmatic friendship.